In the heart of the southern United States during the 19th century, Louisiana was a state marked by an economy based on the cultivation of cotton and sugarcane, activities that heavily relied on enslaved labor. Thousands of black people were kept in inhumane conditions, subjected to the absolute control of white owners whose power was almost unlimited. In the midst of this brutal context, the real story of Gordon began, a man whose courage would profoundly impact the abolitionist movement in the United States and around the world. Although few official records of his birth have survived, it is known that Gordon was raised on a plantation near Baton Rouge, the capital of Louisiana, where he learned from an early age the harsh realities of slavery. Like so many others, he spent his days under scorching sun, planting and harvesting agricultural products while enduring frequent physical punishments for even the smallest infractions of the rules imposed by the overseers. The discipline imposed on the farms had no moral or human limits, and whips were used both as punishment and as psychological control over the enslaved workers. The cries of pain echoed among the trees of rural properties, blending with the sounds of nature, but never reaching the ears of the powerful in big cities. Gordon lived surrounded by this constant violence, witnessing daily the physical and emotional degradation of men, women, and children who had been torn from their native lands or were children of generations born into slavery. Yet, despite such oppression, many enslaved individuals nurtured within themselves the idea of freedom, a deep desire to live without chains, fear, or masters. For some, this meant fleeing northward, where free states offered the possibility of life outside slavery. For others, it was simply dreaming of better days, even if they knew they might never see them. But Gordon was not content with dreams. He wanted action, and his decision to seek freedom would forever change the course of American history. In 1863, when the country was immersed in the American Civil War, the conflict between northern states, more industrialized and opposed to slavery, and southern states, agrarian and dependent on the slave system, reached its peak. In this turbulent scenario, figures like Gordon emerged as symbols of resistance and courage, representing the suffering and struggle of millions of enslaved people scattered across the American South. Before becoming a global icon, however, Gordon was just an ordinary man bearing the weight of an unjust life, yet carrying within him an extraordinary strength. The journey about to begin would start with blood, pain, and courage, and end with images that would shock the world. Gordon's escape began with a seemingly small gesture, but one full of meaning, refusing to obey an arbitrary order from his owner. On that suffocating spring morning in 1863, Gordon was called by his master to perform a task he considered unfair and dangerous, but chose to remain silent and still, refusing to obey. This act of rebellion, though silent, was interpreted as a serious offense by the owner, who decided to punish him exemplarily in front of the other enslaved people. Without hesitation, he ordered the overseer to apply a severe whipping, hoping to intimidate Gordon and prevent others from challenging authority. With his hands tied and his back exposed, Gordon received dozens of lashes, each one tearing his skin and leaving deep marks that would go beyond the body, striking his soul and spirit of fight. As the screams echoed through the walls of the slave quarters, tears filled Gordon's eyes, but also anger, a contained rage growing with every blow. When he was finally released, he staggered to his shack, spending days recovering, hiding his pain and planning his next move. During those silent nights, he knew he could no longer continue living under that yoke and decided that, whatever the cost, he would leave that plantation behind. Planning an escape was no easy task. Besides the constant surveillance of armed overseers, there were slave hunters ready to capture anyone who tried to escape. These men, often accompanied by dogs trained to chase fugitives, turned the forest into a hunting ground for humans, where the only prey had a name and a face. Despite knowing the danger, Gordon decided to act. On the first moonless night, he wore his oldest clothes, took some basic supplies, and left in the dark, guided only by instinct and the northern direction. His goal was clear: reach the territories controlled by the Union Army, where free black people and former slaves fought against the system that oppressed them. He knew the road would be long, dangerous, and uncertain, but the image of his own flesh being torn by the whip served as fuel to keep going. Each step taken that night seemed to echo as a cry for independence, resonating not only in his own ears but also in the history still being written. It was the beginning of an epic journey that, years later, would be remembered as one of the most impactful moments in the fight against slavery in the United States. When Gordon's disappearance was noticed, the owner panicked and immediately hired two groups of slave hunters, brutal and experienced men who already had a reputation for capturing fugitives with merciless methods. One of these groups was led by a man known as Elias Vance, a former soldier who used his tracking skills to hunt enslaved people as if they were wild animals. The other group consisted of 3 men and 2 large dogs, whose barks could be heard from a distance, causing terror in anyone who was fleeing. Fortunately for Gordon, he had already moved far from the plantation and entered a dense swampy forest, where the tall vegetation and swamps made it difficult for his pursuers to advance. Despite having lost blood and being physically weakened by recent wounds, he continued walking, avoiding main roads and following natural trails known only to local inhabitants. With each kilometer traveled, Gordon felt his body begging for rest, but his mind insisted on moving forward, driven by the desire for freedom and the memory of the lashes he had received. During the second night, while sheltering in a shallow cave formed between thick tree roots, he heard the distant bark of the dogs, indicating that the hunters were getting closer. Luckily, the torrential rain falling that night washed away his scent and confused the dog's sense of smell, giving him enough time to change direction and move even further away. Meanwhile, the hunters argued among themselves, frustrated at the difficulty of finding any trace of the escaped slave, which increased tension among them and reduced their chances of success. Gordon, on the other hand, knew he couldn't count on luck for long and needed to find food and clean water before his physical condition deteriorated completely. Along the banks of a quiet stream, he found some wild fruits and drank clean water, renewing his strength and gaining energy to continue. While chewing slowly, he reflected on what it meant to be free, not only physically, but mentally and spiritually, without living under constant fear of being punished. That brief pause was crucial, as it allowed him to rethink his plan and decide to head toward an old route used by enslaved people seeking freedom in the North. Known as the Underground Railroad, this informal network of routes and shelters helped thousands of enslaved people escape, thanks to the support of abolitionist sympathizers and members of the free black community. Although Gordon was unsure whether he could reach any point on this route, the simple idea that there were people willing to help brought a little hope to his tired heart. After days of non-stop walking, Gordon encountered a wide river blocking his path, making immediate crossing impossible. The river was crossed by fallen logs, and he had to improvise a rudimentary raft using thick branches and sturdy vines, in an attempt to cross to the other side. While building his precarious boat, he heard an unexpected noise, the sound of slow, cautious footsteps coming from the nearby forest. Quickly, he hid behind a bush and watched a young black man appear, visibly frightened and wearing torn clothes, looking around as if searching for someone or something. Gordon hesitated for a moment but decided to reveal himself, stepping out of hiding and asking the boy what he was doing alone in such a dangerous place. The young man introduced himself as James, a runaway slave from a neighboring farm, who had lost contact with his escape group after encountering a nighttime hunter. The two men quickly exchanged information, and Gordon decided to invite James to join him, sharing resources and strategies to improve both of their chances of reaching their destination. Together, they finished building the raft and crossed the river carefully, getting completely soaked but emerging unharmed on the other side. From that moment on, the two began traveling together, sharing responsibilities, taking turns watching during the night, and strengthening each other's morale with conversations about the future. James spoke of an aunt who lived in the North in a place called Cincinnati, where she had managed to get a job as a domestic worker and lived in relative safety. Gordon, in turn, shared stories about the Union soldiers and how they accepted black volunteers, offering protection and opportunities to fight for their own freedom. As they moved forward, trust between them grew, and the solidarity of two men who had fled the same hell seemed to be the only light in the darkness surrounding them. One night, while lighting a small fire to cook a rabbit they had hunted, they heard the barking of dogs again, but this time it came from a greater distance. Alert and silent, They extinguished the fire and quickly moved away from the location, taking care not to leave any trace of their passage. They knew that although they were still being pursued, now they were not alone, and that made all the difference. The two men eventually saw what appeared to be a military tent in the distance, rising among the trees of an organized camp. Driven by curiosity and the need for help, the two approached cautiously, keeping their hands visible to show they posed no threat. Soldiers in blue uniforms emerged from behind the trees, rifles in hand, questioning the two men about who they were and what they were doing there. Gordon, with a firm voice, introduced himself as a runaway slave from Louisiana and asked for shelter, assuring them they were willing to help in any way necessary. An older officer, with a gray beard and a serious expression, approached and examined the wounds on Gordon's back, which were still healing after weeks of brutal punishment. The officer, whose name was Captain William Reynolds, seemed impressed by the man's courage and ordered that they be taken to the camp's medical center for evaluation. There, they were greeted by doctors who treated their wounds, gave them clean clothes, and provided decent food, something Gordon hadn't seen in months. While James rested on an improvised cot, Gordon was led to a larger tent, where several officers discussed battle strategies and political matters related to the Civil War. It was there that he met General Benjamin Butler, a commander who had been receiving reports about runaway slaves seeking to enlist in the Union Army. Impressed by Gordon's story, the general asked if he would be willing to participate in a public demonstration, where his image could be used as proof of the cruelty of slavery. Gordon agreed, understanding that his personal experience could serve to mobilize public opinion against the slave system. Days later, photographs of his bare back, marked by deep scars, were taken by an official army photographer and sent to newspapers across the country. These images soon spread internationally, appearing in publications from Europe and generating outrage among abolitionists and supporters of the cause. For many, those photos were more than evidence of a crime. They were the face of American slavery, a visible representation of oppression that had previously been difficult to see. Gordon, once just another anonymous slave, had become a living symbol of resistance and the fight for freedom. The photographs of Gordon were revealed in mid-1863, at a crucial moment in the American Civil War, when the country was divided between slaveholding southern states and free northern states. The photographer responsible for the images was Thomas Hamilton, a professional hired by the Union Army to document scenes of war and portray the reality of freed slaves. When Gordon's photos were developed, everyone in the medical tent fell silent. Before them were the marks of unimaginable violence, engraved on the skin of a man who had survived brutality. The scars on Gordon's back were deep, crisscrossed, and deformed, resembling maps of wounds that told a story without words. Pain, oppression, and the fight for freedom. General Benjamin Butler decided to share these images with abolitionist-aligned newspapers such as Harper's Weekly, one of the most influential publications of the time. Quickly, the photos began circulating not only within the United States but also in Europe, where governments and religious groups had already been pressuring the U.S. to abolish slavery. In London, Paris, and Berlin, the images were published in illustrated magazines, accompanied by emotional texts about the cruelty of the American slave system. For many Europeans, those photographs were concrete proof that reports about slavery in the U.S. were not exaggerations or political propaganda. It was brutal reality. American newspapers, in turn, used the images to mobilize support for the Union Army, showing that the fight against Confederates was also a moral battle. Many black soldiers who volunteered for the Union Army said they had been motivated by Gordon's photographs, seeing in them a reflection of their own stories of suffering. But not everyone reacted with support. In the southern United States, defenders of slavery tried to discredit the images, claiming they were fabrications or exaggerations created to damage the local economy. Some plantation owners even banned their enslaved workers from seeing newspapers with the photos, fearing they would incite revolts or new escapes. Despite this, the symbolic damage had already been done. Gordon had become a public figure, and his image represented something bigger than himself. It was the face of black resistance in the U.S. He knew that although his body had been marked forever, those same marks now served as powerful weapons in the battle against slavery. After the release of his photographs, Gordon decided to take the path of armed struggle and officially enlisted in the Union Army as a volunteer soldier. He joined the 55th Regiment of Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, a unit composed mostly of free black men and former slaves seeking to directly combat the system that had oppressed them. Trained in combat techniques, weapon handling, and strategic marches, Gordon proved disciplined and courageous, quickly earning the respect of his fellow troops. Although he still carried the physical and emotional scars of slavery, he showed impressive mental strength, inspiring other soldiers with his determination. On several occasions, superior officers recognized his leadership skills and appointed him as a special messenger responsible for transporting secret documents between battlefields. His experience as an escapee, accustomed to crossing forests and rivers under pursuit, made him especially useful in nighttime missions and hostile territories. During a surprise attack on a Confederate position near Jackson, Mississippi, Gordon led a small team that managed to infiltrate the enemy camp and steal crucial information about the next rebel offensive. Thanks to that intelligence, the Union Army was able to anticipate the attack and defeat the enemy with minimal losses, a victory attributed directly to Gordon's courage and intelligence. His role in the war began to be recognized beyond the battlefield, and within months he was known among abolitionist leaders as the Soldier of Scars. Leaders like Frederick Douglass, the main black activist of the time, cited Gordon in public speeches as an example of resistance and patriotism. In addition to fighting, Gordon also began participating in events organized by the Union Army, where he shared his personal story and helped raise funds to support other enslaved people seeking freedom. In these presentations, he spoke passionately and clearly, making it clear that the war was not just a territorial dispute, but a moral battle between good and evil. At one of these events, held in Boston, he was cheered by an audience of thousands, including important figures of the time. Even with all the attention, Gordon never lost his humility. He always repeated that he was not a hero by choice, but by necessity, that any man subjected to that torture would have done the same. His story, however, was far from over. The final victory in the Civil War was still distant, and Gordon was determined to be present on the day slavery was truly abolished. As Gordon's photographs circulated around the world, they began generating significant reactions within the American government and the international community. President Abraham Lincoln, who had already been working on drafting the Emancipation Proclamation, saw in the images a powerful way to mobilize public support for the abolition of slavery. In a private meeting with General Butler, Lincoln reportedly said, "That image needs no words, cries out for justice." A few months later, in January 1863, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring freedom for all enslaved people in rebel states, an important step toward total abolition. Although the proclamation did not immediately free all enslaved people, it changed the course of the war, transforming it into a direct fight against slavery. Gordon, who heard the news with emotion, told his fellow soldiers, "This is the first step. Now we must ensure that no one returns to chains." In Europe, British and French governments, which until then had hesitated to support the United States, began to see the conflict through different eyes, influenced by the symbolic power of Gordon's photographs. Letters of support for the abolitionist movement began to appear in European newspapers, pressuring their own governments to sever diplomatic relations with the Confederate States. In London, a group of British activists promoted an exhibition with Gordon's photos, titled The Face of Slavery, which attracted thousands of visitors and raised funds for abolitionist causes. In the United States, pastors and preachers used the images in sermons and services, calling on the faithful to reflect on the sins of slavery and the Christian duty to protect the oppressed. Feminine movements also mobilized, with women's groups writing letters to congressmen demanding stricter laws against slavery and better conditions for former slaves. Even children began learning about Gordon in northern schools, where teachers used the photos as educational tools to teach morality, justice, and human rights. For many, Gordon had transcended his own identity and become a universal symbol of the fight against oppression. Someone whose story could touch hearts anywhere in the world. And, without knowing it, he had become part of something much greater than he imagined. A movement that would change human history forever. But for Gordon, true recognition would come not in the form of applause or honors, but in the full freedom of his people. In April 1865, the American Civil War ended with the surrender of Confederate General Robert Lee before Union forces, ending 4 years of bloody conflict. With the North's victory, slavery was gradually abolished across the country, culminating in the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in December of that same year. Gordon, who fought until the last month of the war, was present in Richmond, Virginia, when the city was occupied by Union forces and enslaved people were liberated en masse. Walking the streets alongside his fellow soldiers, he saw crowds of black people crying with joy, hugging each other, praying, and singing songs of freedom. For Gordon, that moment was the realization of everything he had fought for. Not just his own freedom, but that of millions of people spread across the entire country. After the war ended, he returned to the North, where he was awarded an honorary medal for services rendered to the Union Army, being recognized as a war hero. Refusing political positions and invitations to hold formal roles in government, Gordon chose a more discreet life, dedicating himself to helping freed slaves integrate into free society. He worked as an instructor in schools created for free black people, teaching reading, writing, and basic math, because he believed education would be the key to the future of the African American community. He also collaborated with abolitionist organizations in creating reception centers for newly freed individuals, offering food, shelter, and legal guidance to those in need. Over the following years, he married a woman named Clara, also a former slave, and together they adopted 2 orphan children, building a new family amid the ashes of the past. Although he avoided excessive fame, Gordon continued to be remembered as one of the greatest symbols of black resistance during the era of slavery. His photographs were preserved in museums and historical archives, and his name became part of American history studied in schools and universities. In 1870, Gordon witnessed with pride the approval of the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed voting rights to black men, an important step toward racial equality. Even facing the challenges of the post-war period, including the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and other forms of structural racism, he never lost faith in justice and change. Gordon lived into the early 20th century, watching the world change, but always remembering that, even on the back scarred by lashes, there existed the strength of a people who would no longer accept living in chains. Today, more than 150 years after the events, Gordon's legacy remains alive, echoing in books, documentaries, museums, and collective memories. His story is not just an isolated chapter of the American Civil War, but a vivid portrait of the struggle for dignity, freedom, and equality. The photographs of his bare back, marked by the violence of slavery, are likely the most impactful images of racial oppression from that period. They serve as a visual and visceral reminder that slavery was not just an economic or political issue. It was a human tragedy of epic proportions. Gordon represents not only suffering, but resistance. He shows that even in the midst of horror, it is possible to find the strength to fight, flee, and win. His journey makes us reflect on how many other men and women experienced similar stories, but whose names were forgotten by official history. How many others fled, faced hunters, endured wounds, and found hope? How many died before seeing freedom? Gordon's case is so powerful because he had the opportunity to tell his story, and the world decided to listen. But we must not forget that, although formal slavery has been abolished, modern forms of oppression persist in different parts of the world. Racism, social inequality, labor exploitation, and systemic violence continue to affect millions of people, especially black communities and vulnerable minorities. That is why it is essential that stories like Gordon's are told and remembered, so that we can learn from the past and avoid repeating it. After all, history is not just something that happened long ago. It shapes the present and defines the future. If you are watching this video, know that you can be part of this change. You can be an agent of awareness, justice, and transformation. No matter your origin, color, or belief, what matters is recognizing that every person deserves to live with dignity, respect, and freedom. And if this video touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and share with others, so that more voices join the cause of equality.